Chapter 2. The Interview That Changed Nothing. The interview was meant to bring clarity. That, at least, was what was promised, implicitly, if not explicitly. After the noise, after the months of silence, after the internet had done what it does so efficiently and so brutally, someone was finally going to speak. The person at the center of the story was going to sit down, look into a camera, and tell the world what had actually happened. The speculation would be replaced by testimony. The meme would be replaced by a human being. And perhaps this was the quiet expectation. Something true would emerge. But before we arrive at what was said, there is something worth examining first. Something that tends to go unremarked when we discuss public interviews of this kind. The question is not only what was revealed, the question is why the interview happened at all. And more precisely, why then? We had moved on. By the time Kristin Cabot sat down with Lisa Miller of the New York Times in December 2025, 5 months had passed since the Coldplay concert at Gillette Stadium. 5 months is a very long time in the attention economy. The video had done its rounds. It had been laughed at, dissected, judged, reenacted, debated, and eventually replaced. Because that is what happens now. Nothing holds our attention for long. There is always another story, another spectacle, another moment waiting to take the previous one's place. And this one, like so many before it, had begun to lose its grip. The intensity had faded. The noise had quieted. The moment had begun its slow migration from urgency to memory, which is where most viral moments end up, preserved like insects in amber, present but no longer active. Andy Byron had resigned and disappeared. Astronomer had moved on. The jokes were still searchable but no longer spreading. The women who had felt something tighten in their chests in July had, largely, returned to their ordinary lives. The wound, if not healed, had at least scabbed over. And then the interview called everyone back into the room. Calling the audience back. This is not a neutral act. To speak publicly, especially on a platform of that scale, and then to return 3 months later to do so again on Oprah, is not simply to tell a story. It is to summon attention, to reignite it, to reopen something that the world had, not entirely but sufficiently, begun to close. The December New York Times piece, headlined "The Ritual Shaming of the Woman at the Coldplay Concert," pulled people back into a moment they had emotionally stepped away from, back into the discomfort, back into the judgment, back into the unresolved questions. And then the Oprah Podcast interview on March 17, 2026, a worldwide exclusive, one of the most watched formats in media, did it again, this time at even greater scale. When a story is brought back, it does not return only for the person telling it. It returns for everyone who experienced it the first time, the women who had felt recognition in that 15-second clip, the ones who had lived a version of that moment, the ones who had feared it, the ones who had survived it. They were pulled back too, back into memory, back into emotion, back into the specific, uncomfortable territory that the original clip had opened and that the months in between had allowed to settle. This matters enormously because it reframes the ethics of what follows. When you are responding to something that happened yesterday, the standard for completeness is different than when you have had 5 months, then 8 months, to decide what to say, to whom, and in what order. Cabot had time, she had resources, she had a communication strategy. The Times first, then Oprah, then presumably the speaking circuit that she had already joined. This was not a woman ambushed into speech. This was a woman who chose to speak carefully and on her own terms with considerable forethought. And when you choose to reopen a wound, When you call the world back into a room it had already begun to leave, the standard changes. The obligation of re-entry. Once you step back into a story that the world has begun to move on from, you are no longer responding. You are initiating. You are reopening the file. And when you do that, you take on a responsibility that did not exist when you were simply the subject of a viral moment. Because now you are not defending yourself. You are constructing a narrative. You are shaping how history will understand what happened. You are deciding which version of events will be the one that circulates, the one that sits alongside the clip on search engines, the one that future readers will find when they look for the story of the Coldplay concert and what came after. That is a significant amount of power, and with it comes an obligation. Not to perfection, not to the impossible standard of total transparency that the internet so often demands without meeting itself, but to completeness, to the version of events that is willing to stand without the scaffolding of framing and curation, to truth that does not need to be managed, because truth that needs this much management tends, on close examination, to be something slightly different from the whole thing. The question is not whether Cabot should have spoken. She was entitled to speak. The question is what she was prepared to bring into the space she had so carefully and deliberately reopened, and whether what she brought was the whole of it or merely the version that served her best. The architecture of the narrative. It happened twice. First in December 2025, when Cabot sat with Miller at her home in Rye, New Hampshire, and then again on March 17, 2026, on the Oprah Podcast, a worldwide exclusive, arranged after Winfrey read the Times piece and reached out personally. 2 platforms, 2 carefully chosen venues. Whatever Cabot needed the world to understand, she had every tool available to say it. On the surface, both interviews delivered. They were composed, measured, and emotionally fluent. The questions were careful and the tone warm. We were given context, a marriage already unraveling 4 to 6 weeks before the concert, 2 people who had bonded over shared personal disclosures at lunch, feelings that had developed slowly, a plan, she said, to go to the board together and disclose everything appropriately, a plan that had been set in motion 5 to 6 days before the concert, when they had had a lengthy lunch to discuss restructuring her reporting line so she would no longer report directly to him. The disclosure, she implied, was always coming. It was all there. Enough to soften the edges. Enough to introduce doubt. Enough to make you pause. And yet, something did not move. Before examining what was said, it is worth noticing how the story was structured, because structure is itself a form of argument. It tells you what matters, and by implication, what does not. The Times headline, "The Ritual Shaming of the Woman at the Coldplay Concert," told you something before the first sentence. Oprah's introduction framed it as a story about digital vitriol and the human cost of going viral. Both framings are defensible. Both are real parts of what happened, but both frames also perform a specific function. They position Cabot as the subject of an action, not the agent of one. The shaming happened to her. The vitriol happened to her. The 15 seconds happened to her. The narrative began with her as the one acted upon, and it never quite departed from that position. Clarity is not only about information, it is about alignment, the feeling you get when what is being said matches what is being felt, when the story being offered and the story that is actually there occupy the same space. That alignment never fully arrived. Not in December, not in March. The story was told. It was simply not quite the whole of it. The missing center. As both interviews unfolded, one thing became increasingly clear. The story had a center, and that center was her experience, her shock, her fear, her humiliation, her children and their terror, her career, lost, her appearance, picked apart by strangers, her reputation, a scarlet letter she would carry indefinitely, her inability to find new work, while Byron, she noted with undisguised bitterness, had received considerable interest from other companies within months, her sense of having been left holding the bag. All of this may be valid, much of it is. But a question surfaced quietly and persistently underneath the weight of all that testimony. Where were the others? Because there were other people in this story, people who also did not choose to be in it. There was a wife, Andy Byron's wife, Megan Kerrigan Byron, who in the hours after the concert changed her Facebook profile name before deactivating the account entirely, which had been flooded by strangers. There was the household she maintained. There were children. There were plans for a life that may or may not have included a husband who, according to Cabot's later testimony, had represented himself to her in ways that turned out not to be true. Megan Kerrigan Byron did not sit on any stage. She did not give any interviews. She was not humanized in front of millions of people. She processed whatever she was processing in silence, her Facebook page gone, her name quietly removed from public record. She existed in both interviews only as context. The wife Byron was supposedly separating from, the wife whose status became a matter of contested claim, not as a person in her own right, not as the center of anything. That absence is not incidental, it is structural, and it matters, because the way a story is told determines where empathy flows. When empathy is carefully directed toward the person speaking, toward her children, toward her losses, it flows away from the people who are not in the room. And the person most conspicuously not in the room is the person who, by most reasonable measures, had the most to lose from what happened on July 16th, 2025. Sympathy without accountability. The interviews invited sympathy, and to a considerable extent they received it. How could they not? 50 to 60 death threats, strangers driving past her home like a parade, being followed by cameras, 500 to 600 calls a day at the height of the frenzy, her children afraid, genuinely afraid that they were going to die, a career in ruins, a life upended in the time it takes to play a song. There is no universe in which any of that is proportionate or acceptable. The harassment was real. The threats were real. The dehumanization was real. People who sent death threats to a woman they had seen on a jumbotron for 15 seconds are not engaging in accountability. They are engaging in cruelty dressed in the language of moral outrage. That must be said, and it will not be unsaid here. But sympathy and accountability are not the same thing. They can coexist, but they are not interchangeable. And what the interviews did with considerable skill, and perhaps not entirely consciously, was allow one to gradually absorb the space where the other should have been. There were acknowledgments. To the Times. I made a bad decision and had a couple of high noons and danced and acted inappropriately with my boss, and it's not nothing. And I took accountability, and I gave up my career for that. That's the price I chose to pay. To Oprah, I own the poor decision that I made in that moment, and I've paid an unimaginable price for that. Notice the architecture of each statement. The acknowledgement arrives and is immediately followed by the price paid, as if the price itself closes the account. The poor decision is named, and then what follows is not reflection on the impact of that decision on others, but reflection on what she personally paid. The grammar is consistent across both. I did something, and I have suffered for it. The suffering becomes the accountability. The personal cost becomes the moral reckoning. What is absent is any sustained dwelling. No pause long enough to ask, what did this cost the people on the other side? What does accountability look like for them? Not what did it cost me, but what did my choices, and the choices of the man I was close to, cost the people who were not in that VIP section? That question was never asked, and because it was never asked, it was never answered. Pain versus responsibility. One of the most compelling aspects of both interviews was Cabot's pain. It was visible, articulate, and in many moments genuinely moving. The image of her renting an Airbnb alone in the New Hampshire mountains that first weekend, in too dark a place to show up as a parent, is an image that lands. The description of her children telling her they were afraid she was going to die, that lands too. The sense of having been stripped of everything she had built, of having become a scarlet letter, of being deemed unemployable, while the man who stood next to her on the Jumbotron quietly fielded job offers, that particular unfairness is real and it deserves to be named. But pain, no matter how genuine, does not replace responsibility. It contextualizes it. It humanizes the person experiencing it, but it does not by itself constitute accountability for the effect of one's choices on others. And in both interviews, there were moments where the weight of Cabot's suffering began to subtly reshape the moral geometry of the story. The frame shifted with quiet persistence from "this is what happened" to "this is what happened to me." And once that shift occurs, the entire moral architecture begins to tilt, because now the person at the center is no longer being examined for what they chose, but for what they endured. Both can be true simultaneously, but they are not equal, and the balance between them matters enormously when the story being told will shape how millions of people understand what accountability actually looks like. The Gwyneth Paltrow detail. It is worth pausing on the astronomer advertisement because it illuminates something important about whose suffering was being tracked and whose was not. In late July 2025, with Byron having just resigned and the story at peak velocity, Astronomer released a marketing video that starred Gwyneth Paltrow, Chris Martin's ex-wife, and was produced by Ryan Reynolds' Maximum Effort agency. The ad was clever crisis communication, turning corporate scandal into brand capital. It was also, by any reasonable reading, grotesquely tone-deaf to at least one person: the woman whose life had just been turned inside out by the event it was cheerfully referencing. In the Oprah interview, Cabot named this directly. She called it disappointing. She said it felt like gas on a fire. She said she had expected better from Paltrow in particular, a woman whose public brand had been built in part on the empowerment of other women. Oprah then revealed something significant. She had spoken with Paltrow, who had said she agreed to participate because Astronomer told her that both Cabot and Byron had signed off on the advertisement. They had not. Cabot confirmed that Paltrow had communicated this to her directly, which means that Astronomer, the company that had issued a statement about its commitment to values and culture, had apparently used both Cabot's and Byron's names to secure a celebrity without their knowledge or consent. They had leveraged the scandal as content and the people as props. Cabot was right to be angry, but the anger was directed at the people who had put her back in the spotlight, not at the underlying question the spotlight had originally raised. And that is where the focus remained throughout both interviews, on what had been done to her, not on what had been done through the original choices to someone else. The lie that changed the story. The most significant new information to emerge from the Oprah interview, the detail that genuinely shifted the texture of the story, was what Cabot said, carefully and with notable reluctance, about Byron himself. "He wasn't the person he represented himself to be to me," she told Winfrey. "And lying is a non-negotiable for me. There was a big miss on honesty and integrity." When Winfrey pressed her asking directly whether Byron had told her that he and his wife were separated, Cabot declined to confirm outright. "I want to be really careful," she said, because the world spoke for me and on my behalf, and I don't want to do that to somebody else and their family. But then, a lot of what was represented to me was not true. The implication was clear, even if it was not stated as fact. Byron told Cabot he was also separating from his wife. He represented himself as a man in the same situation she was in. Two people navigating the end of their marriages, both being honest about it. Except that in the weeks after the concert, Byron was seen publicly with his wife, both wearing wedding rings. Megan Kerrigan. Byron had deleted her Facebook account in the hours after the concert went viral. The move of someone to whom the news of a separation was not old news. And Byron himself said nothing, not to Cabot, not to the press, not to the board. He resigned and went silent, leaving Cabot, as she put it, holding the bag. I think he has the luxury of staying silent, and he can go back to work when he's ready, she told Oprah. I don't. I have to explain and justify. This observation is accurate. Men caught in these situations routinely absorb less public punishment than women. But here is where the story becomes genuinely complicated. If Byron misrepresented the status of his marriage to Cabot, then there is a third person who was lied to before Cabot was, and that person is his wife. Megan Kerrigan Byron was not simply collateral damage in a workplace romance gone viral. She may have been the primary victim of a deception that predated the concert entirely, a deception Cabot was eventually told about, but one that Megan had perhaps been living inside for far longer without ever being told anything at all. This is the thread that neither interview pulled on. Cabot expressed her own sense of having been deceived by Byron. She did not extend that logic forward to ask what Byron's deception meant for the woman who had been in a marriage with him, and who, unlike Cabot, had never been given the option of knowing what she was really in. The wife who was not named. There is a silence that speaks more clearly than words. In both interviews, that silence occupied the space where an acknowledgement should have been. Megan Kerrigan Byron was not named. She was not addressed. There was no moment in two separate interviews totaling several hours across the most prominent media platforms in the world where Cabot turned toward the question of what this woman had experienced. No sentence that said, I know that my choices, whatever the context, had consequences for someone who had no say in any of this. No moment that expanded the frame beyond the self. This is understandable in the immediate aftermath. Survival instinct narrows the focus, but the Times interview was 5 months after the concert. The Oprah interview was 8 months after. Cabot had had time to reflect, to speak with a therapist, to think carefully about the story she wanted to tell and how she wanted to tell it. By the time she sat with Oprah, she was on a speaking circuit, professionally packaging this experience, working on, by her own description, changing narratives. She had said publicly that she wanted to challenge how quickly people judge without context. In all of that reflection and preparation, the question of what Megan Kerrigan Byron experienced does not appear to have surfaced as something worth naming aloud. True accountability expands the frame. It does not narrow it. It asks not only what happened to me, but what happened because of me. Not only what did I lose, but who else lost something, and do they deserve to be named in the accounting? The wife who was not named is not a minor character in this story. She is arguably its most important one, and her absence from the telling is one of the most revealing things about what the telling was actually for. Children in the shadows Cabot's children were a central thread of both interviews. Their fear after the death threats began. Her sense of having failed them by being in too dark a place to parent. Her decision to speak publicly was motivated, she said, partly by a desire for her children to see that mistakes should not carry a life sentence. These are real and legitimate concerns. Children should not have to bear the consequences of their parents' public exposure. The terror Cabot's children experienced was genuinely horrifying, and it belongs in the story. But if we are going to speak about the impact on children, we have to speak about all of them. Andy Byron has children too, so presumably does his wife. Children who did not have a platform. Children who did not appear in a sympathetic narrative on Oprah. Children who processed whatever they processed in silence at school, at home, in the specific private horror of having your family's name circulating as a punchline across every social media platform on Earth. Children whose parents' choices became global entertainment without anyone interviewing them about what that felt like. Children do not process betrayal in headlines. They process it in silence. At the dinner table, in the car, in the long nights when they can tell that something has changed and nobody will explain what. That silence, the silence of the children on the other side of this story, was not acknowledged in either interview. And that omission tells us something about the radius of the moral accounting, that it extended to Cabot's children and stopped there. Between courage and curation, there is a difference between courage and curation. It is not always visible from the outside. Both involve speaking. Both involve stepping forward. Both involve a degree of vulnerability that most people would find unbearable. But they do not feel the same. And sometimes, even when everything sounds right, even when the words are the right words and the tone is the right tone, something does not settle. Courage is raw. It risks exposure of the things that are hardest to say, not just the things that are hardest to have done to you. It names what you caused, not only what you suffered. It makes room for the other person, the one who was not in the room, who had no say, who is still silent, even when doing so makes your own position more complicated. Curation is controlled. It is careful. It selects. It protects what must not be seen by keeping the camera on what is easier to show. From the outside, curation and courage can look remarkably similar. Both involve stepping forward into the light. The difference is in what the light is pointed at. The Cabot interviews were, in places, genuinely courageous. There were moments of real vulnerability. The Airbnb in the mountains, the children, the admission about the high noons. But the overarching structure was curatorial. The revelations were shaped. The frame was managed. The things that would have made the story harder, the name of the wife, the experience of Byron's children, the full implications of the alleged deception, were either absent or handled with a care that kept them from landing with their full weight. And that is not nothing, because when a story is reopened without its full weight, it does not resolve. It echoes. What was said and what was not. By the end of the Oprah interview, the question was not what had been revealed, but what had been managed. There was explanation. There was context. There was emotional depth. There was the significant new disclosure about Byron's alleged dishonesty. There was the pointed critique of astronomers' behavior and the asymmetry of consequence between Cabot and Byron. All of that had substance. But there was no moment that felt unguarded, no moment where the story stopped protecting itself, no moment where Cabot seemed to be asking questions she did not already know the answer to. Every revelation arrived shaped, framed, contextualized, stress-tested, which is how people survive public scrutiny, but it is also how you can speak for several hours and leave the most important things unsaid. Omission is not always accidental. Sometimes it is structural. And the omissions in these interviews were consistent in their direction, away from the people who were not in the room, toward the self, toward what had been done to her, away from what had been done, through her choices and another's, to someone else. The risk of incompletion. There is a particular kind of tension that comes from an unfinished story. It does not settle. It lingers. It leaves the audience not with resolution, but with suspicion, a quiet, persistent question that refuses to be filed away. Is this everything? It is not outrage. It is not even anger. It is something quieter and more durable, the sense that something is being held back, that the version on offer is close to the truth, but not quite the whole of it, that there are still pieces in the background, waiting. And that feeling matters not because the audience is owed a confession, not because public trauma demands total transparency, but because Cabot herself made completeness the standard. She chose to speak. She chose a platform designed for revelation. She chose, with considerable deliberateness, to call the world back into a story it had begun to leave. And when you do that, you set a bar. You say, I am bringing you the whole thing. You invite people to measure what they receive against that promise. And when what arrives feels carefully shaped rather than fully revealed, the gap between the promise and the delivery is not forgiven. It is noticed. The narrative on a speaking circuit. There is one more detail worth naming. By the time of the Oprah interview, Cabot was on a speaking circuit. Her listed topic, changing one's own narrative. She was not simply a private person processing a public trauma. She was a professional communicator, packaging that trauma into a message, developing it into a platform, preparing to stand in front of audiences and tell a story about what happens when the world makes assumptions about you. There is nothing inherently wrong with this. People survive hard things and build meaning from them. But it does raise a question about what changing one's own narrative actually means. There is a version that is about truth, replacing a reductive, harmful story with a more complete and honest one. And there is a version that is about something else, replacing one version of events with another that happens to serve the narrator better. Using the language of honesty, complexity, and context to build a story that is easier to live inside. The interviews suggested a measure of both. There was genuine truth-telling. There was also curation, and the curation was consistent in one direction, toward the self, toward what had been done to her, toward the image of a woman wronged by multiple parties, the internet, her former boss, her former company, the celebrities who made ads without her consent. All of those grievances are legitimate, but a narrative that positions its subject primarily as the wronged party, even when that subject also made choices that harmed others, is not the full story. It is a curated one, the interview that changed nothing. The purpose of speaking is not simply to be heard, it is to be understood. And understanding requires more than detail. It requires truth that is willing to stand without the scaffolding of framing, truth that does not need to be managed, truth that does not feel like it has been stress-tested for public consumption before it was offered. By the end of the Oprah interview, there was more information available than there had been before. The story was more complicated than the meme. Cabot was more human than the Jumbotron image. Both of those things are true and both matter, but something had not moved, because what had been offered was not a resolution. It was a reconstruction, and the reconstruction, however carefully and skillfully built, had a gap at its center, a space shaped exactly like the woman whose name was never said, whose experience was never addressed, whose children were never mentioned, whose marriage may have been built on a representation that was not true. Megan Kerrigan Byron is the missing center of both interviews, not because she was the only person harmed, not because Cabot's suffering was not real, but because the most reliable indicator of genuine accountability is whether the person accounting can see beyond their own pain to the pain they may have contributed to, and whether they are willing to name it out loud, even when doing so makes the story harder to tell. Cabot did not do that. And it is worth asking why. Perhaps because she genuinely believes that Byron's alleged deception makes her primarily a victim. Perhaps because she is still too close to her own losses to have the bandwidth to grieve someone else's. Perhaps because the speaking circuit, the platform, the narrative she is building, all of it works better if she is the protagonist of the harm rather than also an agent of it. These explanations are not mutually exclusive. They may all be true simultaneously, but the effect remains the same. When a story is reopened without its full weight, it does not resolve. It echoes. The internet does not sleep. This is one of the realities we cannot escape. Once something has entered the digital space, it does not disappear. It waits. It resurfaces. It reconnects. New information does not replace old narratives. It collides with them. And if something has been omitted, intentionally or not, it does not remain hidden forever. It simply becomes delayed. Byron has said nothing. Not one word publicly in 8 months and counting. He resigned and disappeared. Left Cabot to carry the weight of the public narrative while he moved in silence, his professional network intact, his name fading from active circulation faster than hers. She has to explain and justify, she told Oprah, while he waits for the news cycle to move on, which it eventually will. It always does. But the internet does not fully sleep, and stories that feel unfinished, stories where the most important questions have been answered with something that resembles an answer but is not quite one, have a way of finding their way back, not always in the form of a new revelation, sometimes in the form of a reader who notices the gap and is unwilling to pretend it is not there. This book is that reader. The question that remains. When the Oprah interview ended, one question remained. Not loud, not dramatic, but persistent, the kind that sits in the chest and does not move. Is this everything? Because if it is, then something essential is absent from the accounting, and if it is not, if there are things that were known and chosen not to be said, things that were managed and shaped and kept at the edges of the frame, then what has been offered to the public is not transparency. It is the performance of transparency, which is a very different thing. The gap is not in Kristin Cabot's pain. That is real, and it has been documented carefully. The gap is in what her pain was allowed to obscure. The woman who changed her name on Facebook and then deleted her account entirely. The woman who processed this in silence while the woman who had been closest to her husband built a platform around surviving the aftermath. The woman whose story is still waiting, not for a jumbotron, not for an Oprah interview, not for a speaking circuit, just for someone to notice that she has not yet been given the space to speak. Once you step forward, you do not control what comes next. The question was never whether Cabot should have spoken. The question is what she was prepared to reveal, and whether, in the gap between what was offered and what was withheld, the story that actually happened, the whole of it, all the way around, is still waiting for its full telling.